We know that the food in the US is garbage, but there's also fantastic nutritional options available in the US. So I think that there is a degree of self-responsibility that people have to take. And I think a big factor that's overlooked is obesity during puberty. I think that's a big one. I think poor health during the phase of the life when the endocrine system is developing sets you off for a pretty poor trajectory.
Why do we think we're seeing more of these low testosterone symptoms, and what are those symptoms?
I tend to split it into three. I tend to say it's quite easy to sort of psychological, physical, sexual. So a lot of guys will complain of some degree of, your brain is not working as appropriate as well as it should do. I don't know about Dave, but I see a lot of brain fog when men have low testosterone, maybe some degree of low mood, apathy, lack of motivation, anxiety. Lack of stress resilience is quite a lot of the foundation of all of this. So people can't deal with the same sort of stresses as they used to be able to. And then physically, maybe fatigue, aches and pains. Maybe you get ill a little bit more often as well. There's a role with the immune system in inflammation with testosterone. And then people commonly will know about the sexual symptoms of low T, maybe some degree of erectile dysfunction, less erections, less strong erections, or lowered libido or lack of libido or less overnight morning erections, that sort of thing. But it can affect, that's probably not the exhaustive list, but those are the common ones you'll see. And why we're seeing more of it, I mean, I think it's environmental and lifestyle, really. I don't know if Dave wants to, Dave talks about a lot about, he's got his 3 Ps, which I like is a really good way of putting it as well.
I like things in threes and I like alliteration, so it ticks both my boxes. Pollutions, plastics, and pesticides, I think, are the environmental factors that, I was born in 92 and I was basically wrapped in plastic from a young age, fed the food pyramid that we're brought up on in Australia. And, I grew up in a very privileged household. I had fantastic parents, great socioeconomic environment, but because of how our parents were conditioned, from the 80s and the 90s, the way that we were brought up was to be afraid of the sun. Was, I think, our parents, particularly the baby boomers, often raised us to be happy rather than competent, which, they were doing their best. But I do think that there is that environmental aspect, which is unavoidable. And I've traveled all over the world, and that's one of the privileges I've had in my career is, I'm primarily based in Australia. I've been living in Lithuania for 5 years. I get to speak at events all across the US, and I travel around Europe to see bands and see my friends. And I don't think we can put it all down to the environment, though, because people in Eastern Europe are doing a lot better than people in the US, for example. And we know that the food in the US is garbage, but there's also fantastic nutritional options available in the US. So I think that there is a degree of self-responsibility that people have to take. And I think a big factor that's overlooked is obesity during puberty. I think that's a big one. Like, that's one that, people don't really talk about who read mechanistic theory or spend their time learning about this stuff and, Reddit and YouTube. But when you're in the trenches and you see this stuff and you see it at scale, you can definitely see some trends play out. And I think poor health during the phase of the life when the endocrine system is developing sets you off for a pretty poor trajectory. And when we see this narrative that, men have optimal testosterone levels if they eat well and look after themselves well and they do everything right, that's definitely true in some cases. But I think that there is that combination of the behavioral factors and the lifestyle factors, as well as the environmental factors. And some people had a better start, some people didn't. There's epigenetic things going on there as well. Unhealthy parents have unhealthy children. I'm particularly concerned about the endocrine future of, obese parents who conceived while on SSRI antidepressants. Like, I think we're going to see this get a lot worse before it gets better. And I think that's one of the really important things that I do, Max does, people in my network do, is we're really trying to raise this awareness that when people are having health problems, number one is you do everything you can to optimize your natural testosterone production. And number two, if you're still feeling like rubbish, even though you're doing everything right, it's a much more plausible scientific fact that it is more likely to be an endocrine issue than the fact that you were born with a broken brain. The monoamine hypothesis of depression, that depression is caused by a brain that just can't produce serotonin, was debunked in the 1990s, but that's still common practice for mental health, psychiatry, frontline treatments for depression, everything. So I think one of the reasons that we're seeing more of it is that people's lifestyle is particularly poor, particularly post-COVID, the working from home era that we're in at the moment. People are a lot more indoors, they're a lot more sedentary, they're a lot more glued to their screens. And I think people often don't realize just how much work you have to put into in terms of offsetting that lifestyle to actually be metabolically and physically healthy. So I think it's coming from multiple angles. And I do think that for a lot of people, depending on where they've kind of picked up this journey of whatever phase in their life they're at, I think sometimes it can be a bit of an uphill battle. And I think sometimes, well, actually, I know all the time, we only get one life. We only get one shot at this. We only get one body. We get, X amount of laps around the sun. And I'm a big fan of men wanting to optimize their experience of life. And as long as all the other factors are in play and people have realistic expectations, I think optimizing bioidentical hormone levels is one of the most fantastic ways to build yourself into a man that can ultimately live a life that is satisfying, meaningful, enjoyable, purposeful, and hopefully can make a greater positive impact on the world around you.
If you've just started TRT, it is completely normal to feel overwhelmed and confused. There's a lot of new territory to cover, and there is a lot of conflicting information. I wrote TRT 101 so that you can have everything that you need to know in an instruction manual in one place that you can refer back to, that you can have all the questions answered before they even come up. TRT 101 is my best practice approach for TRT from start to finish, and it contains everything that you need to avoid all the challenges and pitfalls that I've seen come up in my clients over the last 5 years. You can check it out via the link below.
So great answer with that. Max, have you got anything to add?
I would sort of double stamp the obesity during teenage years. I really think that that is something that's profoundly impacting. It's basically when your hormonal system gets set in place. So if you're disrupting that with inflammation, obesity, we know this disrupts your hormones quite drastically. It's likely, at least what we're seeing in practice, is a lot of men are never getting good levels of testosterone, even if they lose their weight after those teenage years. It's almost like men have been on anabolic steroids. It suppresses your own production, and sometimes your own production never recovers that great. But it's the same thing if during your development, you've been essentially unhealthy, then that seems to have a lasting knock-on effect that perhaps we never get great levels, even if we start doing things well at a later date. And then you compound with that the fact that we do have these environmental issues as well. It's kind of like a bit of a perfect storm. But it's something you see in practice a lot. Young, kids into teenage years, obese, it seems to really mess with their hormonal system.
I want to touch on that a bit more, actually. Sorry, Dave.
Yeah, I'm just going to add into that as well, just in terms of like a proof of concept, is that, this is a human issue as well. It's not just men, it's women. And as someone who's, 32, I can say that of all the women who I've met in my entire life within, let's say a 3 to 4 year age kind of, striking distance of myself, I know more women with debilitating period issues, endometriosis and or polycystic ovarian syndrome. I know more women who are having those problems than who don't. So that's kind of how this stuff is showing up in them. And it's absolutely something that I think is impacting the majority of young people. I think it's greater than 50%. And I would wager every dollar I have to my name that more than 50% of people who are around my age, give or take, have suboptimal hormone levels, whether it is to do with diet and lifestyle factors or, I guess, environmental and epigenetic issues as well.
What is testosterone optimization therapy? This is optimizing testosterone levels rather than simply just replacing them. The provider will need to intrinsically understand how testosterone works and how the human body works. So when you follow this process of optimizing testosterone gradually, it allows the patient to acclimatize